Hello, my name is Robert Martin, and thank you for taking the time to watch this 10-minute video. I've been a software developer for over 40 years, and I've worked in different parts of the industry, from telecom to health services, from internal IT to social websites. I'm the author of several books on software development, including these two, Clean Code and The Clean Coder. These two books in particular teach programmers what it means to be a professional software developer. I'm also the purveyor of CleanCoders.com, a website where I sell videos that continue and expand upon the topics in my books. I asked to speak with you today because you're a manager responsible for software. Perhaps you're a team leader, or maybe you're a director of development, perhaps a VP of engineering, or even the CEO of a company dependent upon IT. I asked to speak with you today because in that role you care about software. You are concerned with how much it costs and why it seems so difficult to do it right. You're puzzled by why schedules are almost never met and why costs almost always exceed their budgets. You wonder whether the problem is the programmers, the management, the process, or just something intrinsic to software itself. I'm not here to tell you that I know all the answers. I don't. But I do know one thing. Most software developers don't behave like professionals. I'm not trying to insult my whole industry or demean all developers. I'm just stating a simple fact. Computer programming is barely 50 years old, and there just hasn't been enough time to define a profession and instill the necessary disciplines. You might think that colleges and universities would teach their students how to behave professionally, but for software it's almost completely the opposite. The typical CS grad gets their projects done through spasms of irresponsible heroics like pulling all-nighters. Why don't the schools teach software professionalism? Because it hasn't been defined. They don't know what to teach. Both academia and industry think that a programmer is someone that you stick in a room with requirements, Diet Coke and potato chips, and somehow, mostly through irresponsible heroics, code comes out. And the problem is, the code that comes out is bad. Now, again, I'm not impugning the whole industry. I'm not accusing all developers of being slackers and know-nothings. I'm just, once again, stating a simple fact. The vast quantity of the code written in the last 50 years has been bad. Why? Because it's taken nearly 50 years to figure out what makes code good and what makes code bad. And the old guys like me who've been programming nearly that long, we're few and far between. Most programmers are in their 20s or 30s, and they've never had a significant mentor. Nobody's ever told them, that's good and that's bad. Does it matter? I mean, the code does get written eventually, and it seems to work after a fashion. Yeah, it matters. Consider the following scenarios and see if any of them sound slightly familiar. The first release of the project was a month late, but in the scheme of things, that wasn't too bad. It worked tolerably well, and customers were relatively pleased. There were some bugs, but they were fixed, and overall, the release was considered a success. The second release didn't go so well. It was 6 weeks late, and there were some nasty surprises. The release date had to be postponed several times because of late-breaking bugs and strange instabilities. But after several weekends of heroics, the release finally got out. There were some problems with the installed base, but after a few months of frenzied activity, the customers got over their initial disappointment and everything quieted down. And in the end, you chalked up the difficulties to a one-time event. The third release was a horror scene. It was 3 months late and required 5 months of extra overtime. Even so, it only got out the door after significant features had been cut that had been promised to customers. Bad as things were before the release, It didn't really hit the fan until you shipped it. Then the customer service lines lit up like a Christmas tree with complaints of instabilities and crashes and data loss. And every time you fixed those bugs, more problems were introduced. Customers, already disappointed by the loss of promised features, were so frustrated and disgusted by the instability problems that many reverted to the old release, and whole accounts were lost to competitors. The problem? Bad code. And I'm not joking about this. Bad code. Now you might complain and say, well, yeah, but there's had to have been some bad management, bad estimating, bad planning and scheduling. And yeah, sure, there probably was some of that. But when each release is progressively worse than the one before it, when all attempts to improve management, estimating, scheduling, and planning seem ineffective, and when you just can't seem to change the downward trajectory, the only thing left is the code itself. Can bad code really cause such significant problems? After all, it's just code. Perhaps the best way to explain why bad code can cause such huge problems is to relate it to accounting. How important is it to keep your accounting books clean and orderly? Answer. If you want to know whether or not you're making or losing money, it's pretty damn important. If you want to make sure you're staying legal and paying the appropriate amounts of taxes and fees, it's pretty damn important. And when the IRS comes to audit, it's really damned important. If your books are a mess, you'll spend massive amounts of time just trying to figure out whether your current business plan or your new product line or your latest quality initiative are actually working. You'll spend gobs and gobs of time preparing taxes and trying to write management reports. And for the most part, you'll be flying blind. One of the best ways to lose control over a department, a division, or even a company is to lose control over the accounting. Software and accounting are similar in many ways. They are both highly technical, they require the manipulation of abstract symbols, and they both require intense focus and attention on minutiae and detail. They are both very sensitive to single-point errors. A single-digit error on just the right spreadsheet can take the company down and send the executives to jail. And a single character fault in just the right program can crash the system and send your customers running to your competitors. Bad code is like sloppy accounting. If your software is messy, it takes forever to add new features. The risk of introducing defects is high. And as far as estimates are concerned, you're pretty much flying blind. And just as bad accounting begets more bad accounting, bad code begets more bad code. Messy code makes it hard for developers to complete their tasks. Desperate to meet their deadlines, they start to take shortcuts, leaving the code messier than when they started. And so the situation worsens and worsens until eventually the developers just lose control. Now, you might think that this is just carelessness, and you'd be partially right. But it's really not just a matter of being careful. Programmers in general don't want to do a bad job. They try to be careful. The problem is they don't know how. They don't know what care to take. And that's because they've never been taught the necessary disciplines. Accountants have a set of practices and rules that they follow. They're called the GAAP, the Generally Accepted Accounting Principles, and they include practices such as double-entry bookkeeping. They include standard forms and representations like P&L statements and balance sheets, and a whole host of other procedures, rules, and disciplines. If accountants didn't have the GAAP, they wouldn't know the value of a balance sheet or a profit and loss statement. They wouldn't know how to organize the books in a useful way. They wouldn't practice double-entry bookkeeping. And so, no matter how careful and diligent they were, they'd still make a mess. Until recently, software developers didn't have anything like a GAAP. And most programmers still don't know what the generally accepted programming principles are. So programmers, although they might be careful and diligent, wind up making messes anyway, and they don't know how to prevent this from happening. In the 60s and 70s, early software luminaries such as Edsger Dijkstra, Tom DeMarco, Tony Hoare, and Jerry Weinberg laid the foundation for the principles and practices that were to follow. In the 80s and 90s, people like Grady Booch, Bertrand Meyer, Ivar Jakobsen, and Ward Cunningham built upon that foundation. By the mid-90s, software design principles had been identified, and standard applications of those principles were illuminated by Eric Gamma and a host of others as recurring design patterns. By 1999, we were tackling the problem of the software development process. Project management strategies like Scrum and the other so-called agile methods were introduced, and a set of actionable developer disciplines emerged. What came out of this innovative period was a set of technical practices like test-driven development, refactoring, and continuous integration, embedded in a set of management disciplines like Scrum, Lean, Kanban, or the like. These innovations in both software process and practice have created something akin to the gap for software development. By following these guidelines, programmers can learn to write clean and well-organized code that conforms to a generally accepted set of principles and patterns for software. In short, we now have the means to keep our books clean. Since their inception, adoption of these principles, patterns, practices, and processes has rapidly increased. And yet there are so many programmers in the world today that we've barely scratched the surface. That's why I wrote my books, and that's why I offer my videos, to teach programmers how to be professionals, to teach them the disciplines and the practices that define professional software development, and in some small way, to improve the state of software development in the world. After all, keeping code clean and behaving professionally can only improve a development team's ability to estimate, deliver, and maintain their projects. I can't promise that these disciplines will solve all the problems. I can't promise that there won't be schedule slips, bugs, and upset customers. What I can promise is that when developers adopt a cogent set of disciplines and begin acting like professionals, that these problems will diminish. Thank you for watching. I appreciate your attention. For more information, please watch episode 1 at cleancoders.com. In 23 minutes, it lays out the problem and the solution in far more detail than I've done here. Thank you again, and goodbye.